Hi everyone, good evening. My name is Ho Fang and I'm the publisher of Ethos Books. On behalf of Devadas and Ethos Books, I wish to welcome you to the launch of this new book, Sensing Singapore, Reflections in the Time of Change. He did suggest having a panel discussion to add more chili to this launch, and there was to have a forum going between Nizam, Nicole himself, moderated by Mr. Nizam Ismail. Yeah? So I'll let him introduce the panelists later and the moderator, but meanwhile, let's hear from the man himself. Devadas?
But I'm really humbled that so many of you have taken the time to come to this launch. Launching a book is an exercise in suspending belief, because you can never really bring yourself to believe that people want to read what you have to write until you have them right in front of you, as I do today. So it's enormously gratifying after 18 months of writing to finally meet an audience. When a country evolves, it doesn't and should not evolve in silence. And I think we all have a right to a voice. I think we all have a right to participate in that evolution. And we have a responsibility to do so as well as citizens or people who share this small space that we do, which forms this idea of Singapore. So that's the first and most important thing to know about the book, that it's about saying something. The second thing is about what it's intended to try to do, and it has a purpose beyond the ideas in the commentaries. I hope that what it does is it brings a focus to the need for better governance, as opposed to simply better government or better opposition or better citizenship. I think all these things are contributing factors towards the notion of better governance. If you have better governance, it's a function of better ideas.
Now, Devadas wrote about the role of the public intellectual and how as a society we should be ready to embrace more balanced critique that's founded on sound reasoning and structured debate. So the question for panelists here is, what role, in your view, does a public intellectual play?
The role of a public intellectual fills a gap that other people cannot. So what I'm referring to are perhaps the politicians, the NGOs, the civil activists. All these people have their own, I would say, agenda, very frankly, or they have their own ideological affiliations, or they have stakeholders that might prevent them from saying certain things or be brutally honest and frank. So in that regard, a public intellectual is someone who is completely non-partisan, and by non-partisan I would say not only does he not have a political affiliation, but he is also not bound to anything or anyone, well, unless he's an academic, then that could be bearing on whether he gets his tenure renewed, but that's another story for another day. But yeah, so that's it. A public intellectual is someone who fills the space where other people cannot fill. And they might be able, through their training, give a more macro or more bird's-eye view of issues that perhaps a layman person might not be able to identify. So, yeah.
What Singapore needs at this stage of its development now is more resilience. We are exposed to lots of threats, whether political threats, economic threats, and really when you talk about resilience, he looks at the model of biological community or ecosystem, where the more diversity that exists within that biological ecosystem, the more resilient it is. And that's what we need in Singapore, a more diversity in terms of ideas, in terms of contestation of ideas. That's how you become more resilient. Because the natural tendency for a society that has achieved success is really to be complacent, and then you run the risk of groupthink. You run the risk of an arrogance that the predominant ideology is the one and only correct ideology. And that's what we want to move away from. And I think the publication of your book today is a great way of catalyzing further contestation of ideas within Singapore, and that's what we really need. What we need is to actually welcome diversity and even to institutionalize dissent rather than to go the other way.
Yeah, very good points, and that kind of leads me to the next question as well, around what are the conditions and environment that's needed to encourage more public intellectuals to emerge, and in particular for Singapore, at this stage of our Singapore story, where do you think we are? I think Nizam has sort of alluded to a bit of that, perhaps just to hear from Devadas and Nicole on the same point.
The straight answer to this one's question is the conditions for the participation of public intellectuals are created by the participation of public intellectuals. The more that participate, the more that are involved in a structured debate that obeys certain rules of decency, the focus on the ideas, not the person, I think then the conditions will fall in place. And it will make it more accessible for people to engage those ideas, less threatening for them to not only engage but to respond to them. You can see they will relate to it and say, well, this makes sense, I can play a role here.
So when we talk about creating the right kind of conditions to have, that kind of healthy debate, this is where I put on my opposition cap, and we start looking at the historical context of what Singapore was like in the past, going all the way back to the 50s, with the University Socialist Club. And obviously in the past, there was a lot of democratic debate, there was a lot of spirited, fiery kind of activism that was happening on campus, especially in the universities. Happened subsequently, with the introduction of media regulation, the press and printing act, everything just came all into place, and I think even with the ISA, all of this just imploded, and it just completely suppressed the freedom of expression and the freedom for debate for a very, very long time. To the extent that there was a lot of taboo surrounding opposition views, there was a lot of taboo surrounding dissenting views, to the extent that there were certain dissenting figures who were publicly made bankrupt or publicly humiliated in the process. And you see, and this created really what we call a climate of fear that I think people used to talk about, people used to regard as taboo quite some time back, and I think it's only recently, in the 2011, they call it the watershed elections. I think we've taken this newfound freedom of expression for granted, but I would say right until 2011, it was still very much taboo to even have dissenting views.
Just related question on that. What type of accountability should be held by a public intellectual? The reason I'm asking that question because, after all, it's one thing to opine on a certain issue, but it's yet another to see to the implementation of policies that actually addresses those issues. So, what gives the person the gravitas and the credentials to be an effective public intellectual?
I think there's no easy answer to that question. Obviously, the public intellectual is not in charge of the government, cannot control the executive and what it decides to do. But we are playing an important role in providing ideas, perspectives which allow the executive to have better information and decision space to execute government policy. And then to that extent, the contribution being made by the public intellectual has to be responsible, it has to be intellectually honest and rigorous. It has to have a plain and present agenda and not something that is buried deep within and is trying to drive a society to believe something that other than what has been declared. And I think those standards need to be set by the public and by the peer group of public intellectuals too, to be able to be a community of people who act as a check on each other, not a check on their ideas, but a check on their motives, a check on their standards. And I think that's entirely reasonable and achievable.
I think the answer on accountability of public intellectuals lie with the public, because that's your primary audience. You sell an idea to the public, you try to convince them either with well-argued logic, with research, or even with emotions, I would add. Emotion is not necessarily a bad thing, and that's when he and I agree on that. But ultimately the public will have to judge on how good an idea is or how bad an idea is, or whether an improper motive could be easily exposed in this new age. And I think it's really a contestation of ideas which is not quite easily done. I think social media helps facilitate this. You can expose quite easily, and there are people who are exposed quite easily. Or even good ideas gets debated. I'm sure Just has got his fair share of grief from the views that he gets from his well-thought-through commentaries, but that's the way it is. And I think that's not necessarily a bad thing. That contestation of ideas will lead to an idea that's more good than bad.
So my question for the panel is, what can we do in concrete ways to overcome that barrier? Because I'm sure public intellectuals will step forward. They will assume their natural role in society. They will debate for the greater good of society. But how can we set the environment such that we can overcome perhaps very draconian laws like ISA? How can we even try to overcome people's mindset about voicing their views?
Thank you, Joe, for your kind remarks. I'm not sure I'm going to thank you for the question. It's a very difficult one. I don't have an answer for you other than I've written this book. So I think the best answer I can give is to be an example and to take the risk yourself of putting your ideas out there in public. Ideas are not necessarily always flattering towards the incumbent, but I try to be fair and sincere in what I'm trying to say, and I think that has allowed the ideas to pass through what otherwise would be an impervious layer. I'll give you the example of a piece that I wrote early in 2013, which was called Doing the Right Thing for a Pioneer Generation, calling for the establishment of, I gave a number of $1 billion fund to help those who were now in their 70s and 80s who came through the establishment years of our independence. Several months later, we see the government introduced something very similar. Of course, it was not said during National Day rally because Devadas said this. We did it. I don't know whether that was in any way directly attributed to the article. But I think it's a practical example of being able to contribute an idea that we find traction and so on. What I found works is two things. One, I try to take the ego out of the equation. I try not to make myself the center of the commentary, the center of the idea. The ideas are what it's about. And I'm fairly deliberate about that, to the extent that I have a very low social media profile. I only have 30 people on my Facebook, for instance. And when I look at the feedback, whether it's good or bad, to the articles that I've written over the last 18 months, people tend to preface their comment by saying the author said, instead of using my name, or this is a bad idea, or this is a good idea. And I'm always reassured by that, because I'm not looking for people to agree with me. I'm looking for people to respond to the idea, not to me. And I think that's, I can only speak about personally how I've handled it. I think I've handled it in other ways. But I'd like to think that more participation creates a safer environment for everybody else that comes afterwards.
I think the fear is very real. I mean, I experienced it myself in very real terms. Initially I was more fearless and I got a little bit more fearful. I think I've overcome quite a bit of that, to be honest, on today. And I really think the answer is, whether in the hands of our input or even any other Singaporean, to find your voice, as Daz has said, and to articulate your aspirations, your hopes, your fears. And, get others to also find their voices and to also similarly respond in the way that Daz is trying to do. And as for public intellectuals themselves, I think one important role for them is to look at these barriers of fears, what causes this, and to then play an advocacy role to try and dismantle these tools of fears. Like demonizing the internet. The internet is not an enemy. There's lots of noise in there, but there are lots of also hopes and aspirations and very real views articulated by Singaporeans. Yes, some may not be as eloquent as others, some might be less responsible than others, but don't dismiss the internet as the enemy. It's not just a place for unhappy people. There are lots of happy people there, but there's lots of people who care, who dare articulate their views despite the fears that they may face.
I also think that one thing that prevents a very honest debate is number one, our fear of failure, and number two, a very judgmental society. So a lot of us are very afraid of, the thing is that if you want to refine your views, if you want to make a more robust argument, sometimes the only way to reach that level is to fail and, to keep challenging your own assumptions and to keep arguing with people who don't agree with you so that they tear down your assumptions and you build up new ones, you build up new arguments. The problem with that in Singapore is that there is zero error for arguments, there is zero error for mistakes. So as a result of that, people are just afraid to even start talking. I remember before I joined politics, there are always a lot of things that, personally I wanted to be a writer and all that. But then you're always very afraid of writing the first word. Because before you even start writing, you're already thinking, what if my teacher reads it and they're not going to like it? Or what if someone reads it and that person's going to laugh at me? So I think we need to shake off that sense of, fear of judgment, and we need to start being a society that is not hostile to diverse views, even if we don't agree with them.
Yeah, can I just add that? I mean, I'm so impressed by my panelists because I think that exemplifies something that is ours, which is you need to dare to care. And we need more people to dare to care. We do so in all sorts of small ways in the community. We have lots and lots of people who are doing their thing in the community. It's not about getting attention for yourself. It's not about where we go. And certainly these two individuals exemplify daring to care. I think they make the panel so much better by this being here. The second is something that Nicole talked about, is risk adversity. I think risk-seeking is what we need. This is a country which is an entrepreneurial country. When I think about Singapore, I think about a serial startup at a higher and higher level. We are continually remaking Singapore because we have to. We don't have an extractive economy, we don't have anything. That part is true. And so we have to continually try to reinvent ourselves, and we have been continually doing so for the last 160 years. But being a serial startup needs to be risk-seeking. We can't expect other people to take risk for us. They're going to take risk for themselves, and some of the benefits of doing so are going to spill over to us naturally. However, if we were doing the risk-seeking ourselves, then I think all the benefits will accrue to us. And here I'm not speaking only about politics, I'm speaking also about economics, about business, about professional services. And I think that we have to go back to a point where we are risk-seeking. I look at our history of Singapore as an inverted pyramid. When we first started in the 19th century, you think of a pyramid, the base of the pyramid were tens of thousands of people with micro businesses. Just, they got off the boat, they'd done their essential service, they had to do something. And we had them all starting off with what? Some of them succeeded and became sort of bigger businesses, and some really, really succeeded and became very, very large businesses. And what did they do? The government, the colonial government, would only spend what made sense to them. The absolute minimum necessary for administration and defense and health. Everything else was made up by philanthropy. Very rich people gave money to hospitals and to the roads and community centers, because I think they had a recognition that they won the lottery. There were many others like them who had struggled and for all sorts of reasons failed, and they had succeeded. Since then, we have inverted the pyramid. We now have a few very large companies at the bottom, large government corporations and so on, MNCs. We've got a middling-sized, medium-sized enterprise. And at the top, it's not lots and lots of small people, small startups. It's lots and lots of people asking themselves, how can I find a job with these people at the tip of the scale? I think we've got to stop asking ourselves, how do I find a job? And start asking ourselves, how do we create our own jobs? Because when you do so, you're adding value to the economy. And that's the reason that not only did I write the book, promote the idea, but I started my own company to put that idea into action. I think if more Singaporeans were risk-seeking, we will find ourselves making more progress with the restructuring, and that will have a feedback loop to wages, and that will have a feedback loop to people feeling that they are moving up the ladder. And that I think will do a lot to deal with the angst. Because what we don't want is a situation where we get into a false dichotomy that the government government is here to take care of it. The government is financed by the people of the country. So you have a silly situation where you think that you have to depend on an authority to help you live your life. I think the only authority you need to live your life is yourself. You have to give yourself permission to take this.
Okay, I think we probably have time for one last question. So,
while I'm hearing the panel speak, and particularly Nicole, and this whole thing about the education system being a barrier for the youths to be able to have a say in things. At the back of my head as an educator, I'm asking myself, how then would a youth be allowed in a space that is nurturing enough for these alternative views to form? In other words, what sort of responsibilities do we have in order to nurture the next generation of, if you may say, public intellectuals? So we've got this pool here, so when we think, public intellectuals, although we don't want to say who we are, whether we are public intellectuals, but in order to move on in creating the next, or nurturing the next generation, what are our responsibilities? That's the question. So what I'm saying really is, at the end of the day, do we nurture enough of that safe space for our youths to speak? Not just to speak, to dialogue. And in that, I'm expecting them to engage and to explore and take a stake in these interests. And that's when I hope that the next generation of public intellectuals can be born, I have to say. Thank you.
Well, I'm not going to respond to the various points because I think they all stand on their own and articulated it very well. But I'll give you my own observation of the youth in Singapore. And it's based on watching what's happening in social media as well as my interactions with them and the various talks I've given in universities and so on. Which is that it's not only that they're apathetic, there's a strong streak of fatalism that is running through not only our youth, but I think across the section of society. That somehow Singapore is doomed, we are the lip of an abyss, our MRT is breaking down, so tomorrow is going to be, there was a riot in Little India, oh my god, we are fractured. I don't buy into any of that. The first and foremost thing that an entrepreneurial startup society has to be is optimistic. You have to be optimistic not because of the facts, you have to be optimistic despite the facts. Because there are going to be times when it gets bad. And that's where we were in 1965, 1966. We were there in 1971 when the British decided to pull out, we lost 20% of our GDP. As any business owner knows, if you give up, your business gives up. Your business doesn't give up before you give up. So if you give up in your country is going to give up. It is not an autonomous thing that sits outside you. So I think we just have to pull ourselves together and be optimistic. And when we can't find an answer to a difficult problem, there's always tomorrow and you try again. You try again, and you try again. Because if you don't try, nobody else is going to try. And the solution to confronting difficult problems is not to leave to another country when you assume the problems aren't there. The solution is, after being educated and fed and brought up in a country, is to give back to it. And that doesn't mean don't live overseas and don't go and prosper, but don't give the excuse that because we have so many problems, or assume to be problems, or we want to call them challenges, therefore somewhere else is better and greater and superior. I don't think anything is superior. I think you just have to decide whether the problems are greater than you and your country, or your country and you are greater than the problems. And if you decide the latter, then stick to your guns and play your role.
Thank you, Devadas. I guess it's time to wrap up this panel session. So this big thank you to Devadas, Nicole, Nizam for the very interesting, interactive session, and thank you to the audience as well for some very interesting and thought-provoking questions and ideas as well.
And thank you for your cooperation.
Thank you. So, thank you.